A Palestinian American was beaten to death by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, said the headline this past Friday. And according to the CNN story, Israeli settlers killed a 20-year-old Palestinian American man in the West Bank, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health and an eyewitness, as settler violence against Palestinians ramps up in the occupied territory. Now, before we get to the bottom of what actually happened this past Friday, let's pull back the camera and talk about this problem that everyone's talking about, the problem of settler violence that is allegedly ramping up. Back near the beginning of the war, in January 2024, President Joe Biden signed an executive order that called for sanctions against Israeli activists in Judea and Samaria, activists who were opposed to a Palestinian state, to a two-state solution. And the beginning of that executive order reads as follows: I, Joseph R. Biden Jr., President of the United States of America, find that the situation in the West Bank, in particular, high levels of extremist settler violence, has reached intolerable levels and constitutes a serious threat to the peace, security, and stability of the West Bank and Gaza and Israel and the broader Middle East region. But here's the problem. There is no ramping up of settler violence. It's all a lie. Let me explain. The United Nations produces regular reports on quote-unquote settler violence through the website of an office called the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, otherwise known as OCHA, where it claims to actively document and tally current incidents of nationalist violence in Judea and Samaria, including East Jerusalem. Now, events are classified in this OCHA database according to their outcomes: death or physical injuries, property damage, or incidents that don't involve any damage at all. Now, OCHA's data was studied in depth by a team at Rigavim. That's an Israeli NGO that studied OCHA's data covering the 7-year period, January 2016 to April 2023. So that's before the October 7th war. We'll get to that in a few minutes. The table on OCHA's website, linked under the heading Settler-Related Violence, includes 8,332 incidents involving Israeli settlers and other civilians that occurred in the West Bank, that's Judea and Samaria, or in Israel between January 11th, 2016 and April 30th, 2023. But here's the problem with this database. While they put that number on the front page, that there's 8,332 incidents involving Israeli settlers and other Israeli civilians, when you read the fine print, when you go into the database, when you go into the numbers themselves, here's what you find. First, the database counts Palestinians who were injured or killed during or in response to attacks and terrorist acts that they themselves initiated against Israelis in Judea and Samaria and the rest of the country as victims of settler violence. You get this? Palestinians who committed terrorist acts, who themselves were attacking Israelis when they themselves were injured or killed in defense against them. That's called settler violence. We'll get to some examples in a moment. This UN database also includes thousands of clearly non-violent incidents in its count of violent events. For example, counted among violent events of settler violence are Jewish visits to the Temple Mount. You see, the Muslims who still control the Temple Mount don't allow Jews to pray on the Temple Mount. And they consider all the Jewish tourists and the Jewish visitors, worshipers coming to the Temple Mount as an attack on Islam or as an attack on them. So they actually include in the database thousands of the supposed incidents of settler violence are simply Jewish worshipers visiting the Temple Mount, or tourists visiting archaeological sites in the West Bank, or infrastructure work being legally carried out by the state of Israel for Jewish towns, or traffic accidents in which Palestinians were hurt. These are all counted in the UN database as violent acts by settlers. 19%, so that's about a fifth of the incidents documented in Judea and Samaria, that's the West Bank, involve complaints such as trespassing that refer to Israeli tourists or hikers simply walking through the hills, which didn't cause any damage or assault to anyone, but they were near some Arab town. There was a complaint lodged by Palestinian activists, and it gets counted as settler violence coming to threaten them because some hikers were walking by their Arab village. Also, about a fifth of the incidents listed in the UN database occurred in Jerusalem, not even in Judea and Samaria, and therefore they're not related at all to settler violence. There's no settlers in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is wholly a part of the state of Israel. And about 1,000 of the incidents are based only on a single source, and that's the Palestinian Authority's District Coordination and Liaison Office. So the Palestinian Authority themselves, who obviously have an interest in limiting the presence of Jewish settlement in Judea and Samaria, which they claim as theirs. They're the only source for about 1,000 of the incidents. Now, if we filter out all of these thousands of irrelevant cases, all of these examples we've just given, what's left is only 833 incidents from that 7.5-year period. So that's about 10% of the original number. The original number was about 8,300, and we're left with 833. And what that means is that the allegations are about 9.4 Jewish settler violent acts on average per month over the period we're talking about. And remember, there's 500,000 Jewish settlers in Judea and Samaria. I should also add that senior police officials in the Israeli police have stated on multiple occasions that the overwhelming majority of complaints received by police against settler violence, Jewish violence in Judea and Samaria, turn out to be completely false and are submitted by left-wing NGOs that are operating in Judea and Samaria, whose goal is to delegitimize and demonize the Jewish settlers. According to the OCHA database, there were 7 Palestinians, that's the total, 7 Palestinians killed by Israeli settlers from the beginning of 2023 until October 7th, right? So from the beginning of 2023, for that 9+ months, all the way leading up to October 7th, the OCHA database has 7 Palestinians who were killed by Jews. Among those 7, if you go deep into the fine print in the database, you'll find that among those 7 are the following. Abd al-Karim Badia, who was 21 years old, was shot by an Israeli settler after entering a settlement with knives and explosive devices trying to commit a terrorist act, and he was killed. Another example is 42-year-old Tarek Ode Youssef Ma'ali was shot by an Israeli settler after Ma'ali was trying to stab that settler in a field. So yes, he was killed by an Israeli settler because he tried to stab him. Muhammad Falah Abdallah Shihada was a Hamas terrorist who was killed after murdering 4 Israelis, including 2 minors, by shooting them outside the Jewish community of Eli, and he was then killed. He had just murdered 4 Israelis. He murdered 2 kids, and in the process was killed by an Israeli settler. So these are all part of the 7 total Palestinians who were killed by Israeli settlers in 2023. Now, you might be thinking that the whole settler violence must have increased after October 7th, as Joe Biden said, that it was ramping up, but you'd be wrong. According to OCHA's own numbers, a grand total of 13 West Bank Palestinians have been killed by Israelis in the almost 2 years since October 7th, 2023, which brings us to Friday's incident. So on Friday, this 20-year-old Saifullah Musalet was killed after being severely beaten all over his body by settlers in the town of Sinjil, north of Ramallah. That is the statement of the Palestinian Health Ministry that they released on Friday. Now, according to the IDF, here's the statement that they put out on the official IDF X account. Earlier today, terrorists threw stones at Israeli civilians near Sinjil, resulting in 2 Israeli civilians being lightly injured. Shortly thereafter, a violent confrontation developed in the area between Palestinians and Israeli civilians, which included vandalism of Palestinian property, arson, physical clashes, and stone throwing. The claims of a Palestinian killed and several Palestinians injured as a result of the confrontation are known and are being investigated by the Israeli police and Secret Service. Upon receiving the reports, IDF forces, the Judea Samaria District Police, and Border Police rushed to the scene to disperse the confrontation. The forces used riot dispersal measures in response to the violent confrontation and all the rioters. So there was some sort of violent confrontation. There were some Palestinian activists who were throwing stones, and they were provoking Israeli settlers violently. They were throwing stones at Israeli civilians. They caused some injuries to the Israeli civilians. The Israeli civilians fought back. An altercation ensued. And in the process, reportedly, there were 2 fatalities. Let me add in here that the IDF generally is not a friend of the Israeli settlers. In Israeli media, it's well known that the IDF will often criticize the Israeli settlers. They see them as provocateurs and as causing problems for them. So they're not going to try to protect them. And here in the IDF's own report, we see that there was an altercation. And it could very well be that this Sayfola Musalet, who was killed in the process of this, was killed as a result of the violence between the settlers and between the Palestinians who were throwing rocks. But that's exactly the point. There's a lot more to the story. This wasn't just some innocent Palestinian who was beaten to death by these violent settlers. There was an altercation. If you're going to start a violent altercation by throwing stones, and when we talk about throwing stones, they use slingshots. They often throw stones at cars to make them go off the road. These are actually very dangerous incidents. Sometimes the stone throwing involves large bricks and large rocks that are dropped on people from high places. So when you hear stone throwing, it's not just little pebbles being tossed in different directions, but this was a violent altercation. According to the IDF's own report, this was started by these Palestinian activists. I'll also add in that Hamas put out a statement after this event, and they referred to Sayfola Musalet as a mujahid. A mujahid, from the word jihad, is a holy warrior. They referred to him as someone who was fighting for the cause. So this wasn't some innocent bystander. They would not be treating him as a shaheed, as a martyr, and calling him a mujahid if he wasn't an activist who was involved in this violent altercation. Bottom line is this whole narrative about the ramping up of settler violence and these violent Jewish settlers is all a psyop. It's fake. It is not true. The population, the 500,000 Jews who live in Judea and Samaria, are a peaceful population. And the reason that you're seeing all these stories, the reason these left-wing NGOs and the UN are pushing this narrative of settler violence is to set the predicate to remove the Jews from Judea and Samaria in the hopes of creating a Palestinian state, which is never going to happen. All the reasons why a Palestinian state is a terrible idea that will never happen are detailed in a number of the articles in the ebook that you can download in the description of this video. But again, bottom line is there will never be a Palestinian state, and the Jews who have returned to Judea and Samaria are a peaceful, law-abiding population.